So a few of the highlights that we wanted to pick out for you are some of these new malting spring barley varieties, which are giving, exciting new yield potential and very welcome for that reason. We have a few more options now in spring oats, although, again, a very established, market need there and a need to check with markets. Plenty of choice in the distilling wheat varieties as ever, and we'll pick out a few of the highlights there and a couple of new varieties in the 2018 list. And again, I'll talk about the winter barleys where the best developments are in the 6 rows in terms of new yield potential. You can tell I've got disease on the brain. So looking at the harvest reports for last year, the total cereal production was 2.86 million, as the slide tells you, which is actually slightly back on the 10-year average. So spring barley was down 85,000 tonnes. Partly it didn't enjoy that dry spring. And really, as an observation, we're seeing better yield potential coming through in trial data, but it's not quite translating into on-farm yields. And Julian will talk about the need for increased yield to bring profitability into farm businesses. So if you take something like spring barley, where the mean yield there is 5.8, it's 7.4 in the trials. And if we could translate some of that into commercial practice, we could start to deliver on the 1.6 million tonne market that we could have for spring barley, or the million tonne plus that we could have for wheat. So if we look at the spring barley list, you can see 3 new entries there. So you've got Diablo and Tomahawk at the top there, so 109% of the control varieties. So that's a really exciting yield development. And you can see there the various uses for which they can be put. So Diablo for brewing and distilling, Tomahawk potential for distilling. Laureate is one that we've been interested in for a number of years, so it's fully recommended, 105% of potential yield compared to the controls, full approval for brewing and distilling, and useful additional disease traits. So, I've banged on for long enough this morning about, the advantages of varietal resistance, but there where you've got, a 6 for Rinco compared to an old favourite like Concerto where we're down at a 4, that brings you really useful agronomic features. A few others to pick out there. Asteroid, so that's new with, as you can see, brewing, distilling and grain distilling there. Slightly lower specific weight. Fairing, Neil mentioned specifically, so it has a niche use there, not the highest yielding, but again, useful agronomic features that I'll pick out for you later. You've then got the brewing varieties there, some of which, could also be considered for feed, because of, again, you're looking at, relatively high yield potential there. And you've got Scholar still there on the list as a recommended feed variety. The winter barley list for next year, you can see, a relatively tight range of yields for those 2-row varieties at the top of the list there. So you've got Creswell, Orwell. Creswell's coming in there. It's in its 2nd year of provisional approval. Cassia still has that, specialist market, based on that sort of, attractive specific weight. So it has a niche. But again, it's an older variety, slightly outclassed for yield and weak for diseases. So when we look at the winter barley diseases, there's certainly room for improvement there in the Rinco scores range from 4 up to 7. And similarly, a big variability in mildew ratings and ramularia ratings. If you look at Funky and Astaire there, you're into some of these 6 rows, and that's where we see the really exciting developments when it comes to yield improvements. So you can see there the Funky and Astaire sitting there as 6 rows. Sunningdale being another one there where we've got a hybrid 6 rows. So some really nice yield developments there, and you can pick out the new ones as we come down the list there. So that's where the exciting developments in terms of yield are starting to come through to us. The winter wheat list, we focus the Scottish list on the distilling varieties, those soft varieties where we've got a good market. So that's, clearly where the main draw is. Again, you can see useful developments there. So if you look at, we've got Jackal and Elation new onto the list there. So rated good for distilling for Elation and medium for the Jackal. And we've got some more established varieties running down the list there. A smaller choice when you get to the biscuit wheats. And again, a small note of caution there. It is a limited market. You can look at something like Zulu, which has approval for both markets. And then you get into the hard milling, where again, we've got a much more limited choice. It is a much smaller market with some niche. Now, we know for the winter wheats that disease management is an issue, so you rock between varieties that are rated 4 up to some that are rated 7. So if we pick out something like Sundance, which now comes in with a useful yield advance, but also a Septoria rating of 7.4, that's really useful. And similarly for yellow rust, it's one that we worry a lot about the shifts in yellow rust races, but actually you have a lot of varieties there with very good rust ratings, and only a few where you would be concerned. So things like Myriad that slipped down to a 4, Revelation and Illicit. So, again, you can factor in those varietal ratings to your programmes. A few there that have slipped off the list, so Horatio and Savella we don't rate anymore. A little more choice coming into your spring oats there at the top of the table. So you have a new variety there in Delphin, so that's its first year with provisional approval. I'll come back and talk a little bit more detail about some of these. And you've got some of the more established varieties there, so something like Aspen becoming slightly outclassed, and we've got Canyon and Montrose there. And again, but with oats particularly, that security in how they mill is really secure. Eliane there is another new variety coming through, and I'll come back to that. But you can see that's, you've got something like Firth with its 19th year on the list. We're due for some new developments in this field. There's your winter oats. So again, you've a couple of established varieties in the marketplace there still with recommendations. So if we look in more detail at Concerto as the kind of standard that we have to beat for spring barley, 10th year on the recommended list, and maybe a feature to pick out there, the 7.4 yield that we get in the control varieties in the trials, which we're not getting on farm. But you can see how far short of that Concerto now falls. But because of that secure market, it's still 3/4 of the intake. So it clearly, it has that good grain and malt quality. We know we have issues with skinning, so it doesn't like the wetting and drying, and we get skinning issues. It does have issues with Rhynchosporium, so rating of 4 there. So it carries that known weakness, which is useful if we then compare it with Laureate. So it has full approval from the Malt and Barley Committee, promising grain quality, 12% higher yielding than Concerto, so that makes a real difference to your on-farm figures, and stronger agronomic features. So again, it's carrying better wrinkle resistance and a slightly lower specific weight. There would be the only small caveat. Sienna, again, full approval for distilling, 10% higher yielding than Concerto, better straw strength, better Rhynchosporium resistant, good specific weight, and really that's just a watch and wait. We'll need to see how Laureate goes to see how much of the market Sienna will take up. And Sassy, another one where we're getting that useful yield lift over Concerto. Again, some nice features there, moderate for straw stiffness and brackling, low screenings, quite a lot of straw. And again, it's a watch and wait, see how much of the market Laureate takes to see where Sassy will fit in. Now, Fairing as a grain distilling market has a variety has a niche there, so it's its 3rd year on the list, 5% improvement over Belgravia, the previous standard. It's an early variety which might be of interest to you in the northeast. And a nice balance of agronomic features, so carrying a 7 for Rhynchosporium. So again, you can really moderate your inputs at T1 on that variety. A couple of these new entries. So here's Diablo, first year on the list. So it's under testing for brewing and distilling, very high yielding. So it's another 4%, 109%, 4% above laureate. Marginally later, so it's plus a day compared to Concerto. Intermediate straw length, good brackling. So one to watch. And another one from the same stable, Tomahawk. Again, it's under testing, so a watch and wait. Very high yielding, so again, it's above laureate, 2% above laureate. Again, a little bit later than Concerto, shortish, sometimes a lower specific weight. An asteroid with a range of markets there, potentially, brewing, distilling and grain distilling. New on the list, intermediate yield, so it's starting to come in below laureate, although that range might be attractive. Slightly later than Concerto, good specific weights and low screenings, so some nice features in that variety. Brewing varieties, which, as I've said, you could also consider for feed use. You've got Planet, Arena and Propino, all with, different features. You see the rankings for yield pan out there. Scholar is a feed variety sitting well ahead of Wagon in terms of yield, so we can certainly better Concerto for these particular markets. Spring oats, as I've said, there's a couple of new choices coming through there. So you see the established varieties in the pale green and these new ones in the dark green there. Delphin, very high yielding, so you see it at 105%, intermediate kernel content, specific weight. It's very tall, nice stiff straw. Yukon again, high yielding, intermediate for kernel content and specific weight, and a tall, stiff straw. And here's Elian, which is not quite so good for yield, although still fairly high yielding, but again, some useful features in that variety, and just be guided by, what the millers are wanting. Oops, these slides were meant to be hidden. So if I go to just to summarize that for you, Laureate's clearly the one to watch, and it's growing its market share. And Sassy and Sienna will develop some market interest behind that. They all have their own useful features, so we'll see how they do. Fairing has potential for grain distilling and some nice agronomic features as well, so it's another one that's interesting. These new varieties with that really enhanced, up to 109% of established yield, these are exciting developments for us to take forward. But you have a couple of these varieties here which you can think of for brewing and feed use. Obviously for spring oats, we've got these established varieties remaining as the market leaders, but there's scope for some of these newer varieties to come in and take some of that share. Delphin being that new variety with high yield potential, but a couple of others in the mix there for you too. For winter barley, as I've said, we've obviously got the most exciting development in these new 6-row varieties. So some really nice yield enhancements coming through. Obviously, the winter barley is a much smaller crop for us, but where you've got these enhanced yield improvements are useful. But also, if you look at these 6-row varieties, they all carry 7s for Rhynchosporium. So again, that gives you useful, disease management for a high-risk crop. And for winter wheat there, as ever, plenty of choice for distilling wheat varieties, but we've got new varieties coming through, like Jacqueline Elation with nicely enhanced yield. And we've also got varieties like Sundance, which were on the list last year. But Sundance, again, I would highlight as being one of the new developments in having better septoria resistance. And that's a really useful thing to see coming through into the marketplace for you. So thank you very much. A couple of links there for you. Obviously, the AHDB is a very good source of information on varieties. And the Scottish list, if you just Google SRUC cereals 2018, you'll get to the Scottish list as well, which picks out the ones of particular interest to us.